Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Low Key Legends, where we dive into the minds of some of the most creative people in the world so I can bring you nuggets of wisdom and entrepreneurial advice. My guest this week is none other than Patrick Torres, the partner and creative director at Studio Freight, currently based in New York City, but with a team working from all around the world. We dive into art, music, running a remote team, internal studio culture, educating ourselves so that we can achieve higher levels of success. You won't want to miss this episode. So without further ado, let's get into it. Patrick, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. This is actually our first time getting to meet. Chatted with Clayton and just everyone, I feel like just over social media at this point, but it's good to finally actually see face to face and have a conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Right on. And I wanted to kick things off with a more fun topic and ask what the music you were listening in high school was like, and what were the bands that kind of shaped you as kind of a teenager growing up, and how did that influence you and your creativity, and how is it different now than it was back in the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was like coming into like my teenage years, we got introduced to bands like Nirvana and eventually like things like Black Flag. And that was mostly through like skateboarding scene and kind of the local kids kind of running around and stuff. And so that stuff had a big impact on me really early. And as one does, you try to dig for more once you find something that kind of resonates with you. So I feel like it's like kind of the typical like punk rock kind of like rabbit hole, right? Like Dead Kennedys and the Misfits, and then bands like Anti-Flag or whatever out of Pittsburgh and stuff like that. So I was specifically really drawn to like a lot of the hardcore punk rock stuff, American punk rock stuff from the 80s. So stuff like Bad Brains and Fear, Minor Threat specifically, right? And the thing that I love so much about all of those bands is that there was this really strong DIY work ethic, right? So you have these kids that are coming from like suburban towns and they're starting labels, they're doing their own publishing and distribution and tour, like everything is self-funded, there's no record label. That stuff was always super interesting to me. But as I got a little bit older in high school, meeting new people and being open to new experiences, I started getting introduced to like things in the hip hop scene, like obviously stuff like Wu-Tang Clan, which is kind of the same vein, right? Like these self-made guys who are just doing what they can with what they have. And so that really opened me up to a lot of stuff. And then eventually I got introduced to electronic music, which seems so different than the rest of that. But there was something really interesting about just figuring it out on your own. And a lot of electronic musicians and artists do that for themselves. And so I would say that I still listen to a lot of the same stuff, but I would say I'm definitely more into the electronic thing now. And I would say that's probably the biggest change. And they always say that you listen to the stuff that you grew up listening to in high school. For me, that's kind of true. Like I go back and listen to some of that stuff, but I'm always kind of looking for new things and new approaches. So, but I would say the heaviest rotation is contemporary electronic stuff.
I feel like it comes across like even in like the Studio Freight aesthetic and vibe overall, there's a element of music that translates through, well, definitely your animation pieces that you put out into like social media. But do you think that music impacts your work on a day-to-day basis at the studio?
Yeah, I would say that is a very important part of Studio Freight and the culture. We're very concerned about what's happening in music and always sharing playlists. We usually build a playlist for every project. We're sharing new releases, giving our thoughts around stuff. Like the newest Travis Scott album just dropped to date this podcast for you, but we all have very intense thoughts about that and how that's being received. Every time Kendrick Lamar drops something, like that stops the studio, and we always have a big conversation around that. But we're constantly trying to pull that thread of music and inspiration through the project work, right? It's such a big part of how we think about visual creativity as well. So yeah, I would say music is extremely important to the studio.
I've been fascinated by how the kids who grew up skating, causing mischief, snowboarding, or doing kind of like those similar types of activities, maybe because of the aesthetic and the culture, subculture around that, found their way into design because of just how cool it was. And then you wanted to end up doing those types of things. Do you think that like, as like a kid growing up skateboarding, that you wanted to kind of use your artistic talents and then kind of mimic a job that kind of fit that? Or how did you kind of fall into the design side of things?
Yeah, that's almost exactly what happened, right? So I grew up in this super small town in the middle of nowhere, Southern Ohio, right? And in a place called Wayne National Forest. If you were to look at that on Google Maps, for example, like it's just a sea of green. It's literally just forest everywhere. And so what that means is that there's no concrete anywhere, right? There's no skate parks, there's none of that stuff. So as a result, we had to build all of our own stuff. So we're constantly trying to figure out, how do we get plans? How do we get lumber? How can we convince our dads to let us like steal the power tools? You know, in most cases, you just have to kind of take that stuff and ask for, you know, forgiveness later. But the creativity is kind of built into it, right? You have to figure out how to do it for yourself. And for us, because like we didn't live in a city, there's no skate shop to go grab stickers or shirts. Like we just made a lot of that stuff. And so that DIY part of it was like, okay, well, if we want art, we have to make it. You know, if we want graphics, we have to figure out things about it. So you know, really early, a lot of us were super into making our own band shirts, making our own flyers and posters for events and, you know, like competitions that we would put on and stuff like that, just because it just like, that looked like the thing that you were supposed to do. So, you know, you're at this point, and I'm aging myself here, but like, you're just kind of seeing the outside world through like magazines and album art, and just whatever you can get your hands on, like, you know, literally. And so eventually that sort of leads to, okay, well, maybe I want to start like a skateboard company or something, right? And so you start making your own deck graphics and kind of imagining what the graphics, or the graphic identity for your label could be or whatever. And it turns out that that's actually graphic design or like brand design. And so you're just kind of doing these things from this place of like from a naive place, right? And then you go out into the outside world, you go to school, and you learn like, oh, like people get paid to do this. I didn't even know. Like, you know, we were just making stencils and stickers and all this stuff, but you can make that stuff and get paid. So that was really kind of the segue into it. It just came from a place of like, we need to do this because we want to. And then it became like, I have to do it. And if I can get paid, that's even better.
Yeah, that translation of like the things that you loved as a kid into a job later down the road, kind of stumbling into it. And from talking with Clayton, it sounded like Studio Freight started more with the physical side of things, doing wall art, doing branding, doing kind of almost everything else besides Webb. When did Webb come into the picture?
So that's a little misleading because we've been working on web stuff from the very beginning. And I think that that was really just from a like a place of not knowing how to really clearly define what our offering should have been. So when we would have met Clayton back in, I think 2017, 2018, somewhere in there, we were doing like almost everything by hand. So 1 week we'd be literally drawing with pencils on tracing paper, you know, iterations of logos. And in the same week, we're doing a mural for some like nonprofit down the street. And then we would come back and work on a website for, you know, whatever local tech company. And it was at that point, we're just trying to get as many reps in as we possibly could and just trying to figure out, okay, well, it's all design and we'll just take it all on. Whatever project sounds interesting to us, we're just going to figure out how to do it. And so at the inception of Freight, we always wanted to work with technology in some capacity. And for us at the beginning, it was like hacking Squarespaces together, right? Like it didn't matter. We still have the same goal of we're trying to get graphic design on the internet. And so we were just trying to figure out how that made sense for us at the time. And eventually that had evolved, right? So as we developed our focus around brand identity and strategy, we kind of put Webb on the back burner until the right opportunity came to us, and then we said, okay, now that we have the tools and the tech and maybe the network to build this out a little bit more, maybe we can realize this thing in a way that we've kind of always imagined but not been able to. And that's when we met our fourth and final partner, Franco Arza. We were paired up with him on a project called Elliot, which is this poster that's right up here behind me. And we just never met somebody who cared about the development as much as we cared about the design. And he was so willing to just like listen to us and figure out like really where we were coming from a brand POV. And I think he was just happy to build like fun shit. And we just kind of didn't know better, actually, right? Like, so we're just like, oh, can we do this? And can we do that? And he was like just saying yes to everything, which most developers in our experience up to that point were saying no always to everything. He just never said no. And what it ended up being was kind of fuel to this fire that we didn't know that we had, which was like, oh, maybe we can start to put graphic design on the internet in a way that we're not really seeing. And I think that was around 2019 when that happened. So it was a few years after the studio had started, and it's not been the same since. It was transformative for us.
I'd like to kind of go back to the idea of making cool shit. And I'm assuming that holds like just as true then as it did now, because I'm seeing it in the work. But how much is that encouraged during the day-to-day with kind of client work, as well as kind of like passion projects, or maybe even the encouragement of team to make cool shit outside of the office? I just am curious about diving into your kind of team culture and seeing how it reflects to ours.
For us, the bar is always like continually higher, and we set all of these sort of like limitations on ourselves in terms of like what we can and can't do on certain projects. Like for example, here's a small thing, right? We've never used the same typeface on 2 projects. So that's kind of a line that we draw in the sand. Like, we're kind of putting the past behind us very rapidly and saying like, okay, if we're moving on to this project, let's be careful not to make it too similar to these other projects that we've done in a similar category, or not borrow too much of the same motifs that we see in other places. We're continually trying to push our designers and our devs, who we very much view as being part of the creative team, into new territory. And that has some consequences, right? Like, it can kind of feel like you're starting from scratch every time, but that maybe is a good thing because you're sort of figuring out new problems and new approaches to those problems. And it puts pressure on people too, because you're constantly sort of, like put in this position where it's like, well, I have to come up with something new again. Like, how much gas can one person really have in their tank, right? That can be tricky. But I think once we can sort of massage that in a place where it's like, actually, this is kind of what you do for a living, and like, let's just remove the barriers of the complexities and let the problems exist within the work, then it opens up the gates, and then we can just be free to make the project what it needs to be.
Does that only apply to typefaces, or are you really just trying to push the boundaries every single project and kind of try new things for the sake of kind of leveling up internally and just trying new things to evolve and never staying static?
It's really about always feeling like we have a place to go, right? Because I think that's the difference between working in a studio or an agency versus working in-house somewhere where you're kind of just like rinse and repeat, and the progression of the brand that you're working on is like incremental at best. You can only get away with so much before you're sort of pushing on the barriers of what's not acceptable.
Yeah.
But here, it's the opposite of that, right? And I think that we've really assembled a team where they crave that. And if they have to work on something too much, then there's a different sort of pressure that's applied there, right? Where it's like, this feels stale and static now. Like, I'm ready to move on. So I think for the studio, we've really optimized our process to be adaptive and to move through like different industries and different verticals, different founders, especially, right? So I feel like we're always like, we've done a lot of work in venture capital, for example, right? And it's probably not the thing that comes to mind when you think of Studio Crate or our work, but it's one of my favorite categories to work within because they all kind of do the same thing, but they have such different approaches and they're always asking for something different. It's a refreshing place to go and see like what we can do with the same kind of information and present it in, a way that's 10, 20, 30% different than the time that we did it before, right? So like one VC that we do out of Columbus might have a totally different perspective than the one coming out of New York. So the challenges that we come across in those projects, they're completely different. And we also have to say to ourselves, like, okay, we have to be sure not to just give everybody the same thing. We don't want to do that anyway. How can we really push this to be what it needs to be? And that really just comes down to the people that are involved. You kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier too, right? Like, what's the vibe based on, like, if you could think about like an album, for example, right? Like every release that Kendrick Lamar puts out has a totally different like world or universe that's kind of contained within it. And I guess that's kind of how we think about our projects too, right? So our process sort of allows us to dig into those worlds a little bit and kind of kick over those stones that I don't think that everybody's willing to kick over. And I think because of our people, because of the creative sort of limitations we put around our team and the creative liberties that we give them, we're always able to get a different result every time. Because there are force functions there, right? Like, you can't make another blue brand with a Klim typeface. Like, you can't do it this time. So what else is left on the table? And I think some people might look at that challenge and think, this is really difficult for me to see beyond that. But if you're willing to kind of get over that hump, that's where the interesting stuff really starts to happen.
Now I'm just selfishly prying at your process. Where inside of the process do you kind of start to encourage that experimentation? Is it like anywhere from like square one wireframing, or is it like round one of the design phase, or even like, hey, let's think of a weird concept. How does this brand relate to this idea, and what can we push forward?
It starts there. And that's really from like a strategic POV, right? And strategy is something that we're continuing to build out at the studio. Actually, some really exciting things to come on that side of things right now. But typically coming out of our strategy phase, we'll have sort of this big idea that we're trying to latch onto and then figure out, okay, here's one idea. What routes can we take this thing? How can we really start to push it? How can it manifest? Let's look at an example, like something like love, for instance. Like, there are a lot of different types of love. There's romantic love, there's platonic love. Those are two very different lanes that we can take this thing, right? Like, you feel a lot different about your girlfriend than you do, like your best friend or your dog, or your love for like, your childhood home. Like, those are all different things and have different associations with them. So depending on what it is that we're talking about and what's relevant, we can start to build out different languages, or we typically refer to it as vocabularies. We can build out different vocabularies for those things. So obviously romantic love has things like hearts and cherubs and Valentines and stuff like that, right? But then there's like this idea of like familial love, right? Like the brotherly love. And it's something totally different. And so if we talk about brotherly love, it's like one of those things where you get maybe some more interesting, insightful things starting to happen, where it's like, it's okay for me to beat up my little brother, but nobody else is allowed to do that, right? Like, I will viciously. It's a totally different like set of vocabulary words and stories and ideas that we get to kind of play with. So generally what we'll do is we'll latch onto a couple of different routes like that, and then the designers will take them and just kind of roll with them and see what comes out of that. And so both answers are correct, but generally, the companies that we're working with, they'll gravitate towards one over the other because one's more obvious. But sometimes they're kind of equal, right? And they'll have a hard time choosing, and that's when we say to them, hey, you got to go get buy-in from your team and see what feels right to them, because there's no focus group in the world that's going to qualify that for you.
I think a lot of our process is kind of designed around building it for like the company's team and in internal missions, and trying to make them realize what is best for them. And we always, like you're saying, do two different directions at a minimum, so that they can have a hard no and kind of see a multitude of different ideas or vibes and or universes. I do like the Kendrick Lamar example, and we'll definitely go back to what your favorite Kendrick album is, and I'll force you to pick for the whole world to hear. But I think that's a beautiful way to do it, because it makes that team have a true, clear opinion and hash it out and really kind of figure out what it is that makes their team special and how do they show it visually.
Yeah, I think for us too, it's the best thing that can happen is when we present a concept like that, there's a definitive yes, right? This is absolutely what X company looks like. But the second best thing is for them to be like, we love this. We love them both so much. We actually had a fight over which one it was, which, there's a little bit of tension there. And sometimes, I've personally gotten calls from CEOs who would be like, I don't know what to choose. Like, can you help guide us? And my response to that is always, they're both right, and you have to choose. Like, we can't choose that for you because you know and understand your business. Just take the weekend to think about it a little bit more. I promise you something will become clear. And let's go from there. And inevitably, that's exactly what happens. I think we spend so much time building trust in different ways with our clients through the process. Our process really is designed to put trust first, because inevitably at some point, we're going to ask them to make a leap with us. And that can only come once we have trust from them in really specific ways. So through the process, we're giving them a lot and we're taking a lot from them. And it's that exchange in which we need them to participate. So once we get to a place where we're like, we really believe that this is going to help differentiate you from other people in your space. I know it's a little scary, but trust us, we've been here before. We're going to take really good care of you and the team, and we're going to stick the landing. And that's what happens. Our process hasn't failed many times, less than I can count on one hand, which is something I'm super, super grateful for. But yeah, I mean, we're always open to know what people think, and we do guide them, and we'll definitely tell them when we think that they're making the wrong decision around something. But that said, we never present options that we're not 100% invested in committing to, because inevitably people will pick that option. Like, if you're not 100% on something, you just should never show it, because that's what people pick every time.
And it's the thing that's just going to hurt you in the long run and makes you never want to show it, or inevitably it'll get out into the world, and then it's just a kind of hit on your reputation in a way.
Exactly. And we always want the team to be able to take things and work on them because they're excited about it, not because they feel forced into a corner. There's nothing worse than having to work on something because it's been dictated to you. We're always looking for these reasons to care about things, and that's how we try to motivate the designers and the developers. Find a reason to care about it. And if you can get that, then you'll want to work on it, and then you'll just put more into it because you're just kind of thinking about it in the back of your head, kind of at all times until the project is over.
I feel like every founder has a unique mark that they leave on the culture of their company. So I'm curious, kind of like what it is that you brought to the company, maybe in the beginning, that has kind of evolved over time and kind of has left like a lasting mark, and would even potentially live on, let's say, if you ended up leaving or changed your mind or transitioned.
It's easily education. So I spent a lot of time in school and actually went back to teach for a while. And I think that, a couple of years ago, when we first started working remote, almost exclusively remote, this sort of chasm was created. I had moved to New York in 2019, right before the pandemic had happened. So I was here working alone, totally in isolation from the rest of the team. Nobody had developed good remote working habits yet. So Google Meets, Zooms, even Slack wasn't something that we were using a lot. And I mean, we had our technical director, Franco, who's based in Argentina. And so we were starting to build those reps in with that stuff, but we didn't have this really great digital culture yet. Right. And I started to feel pretty isolated from that. And, when you have a team that's as high octane as the Studio Freight design team is, and how fast and hard and iteratively they work, if you have a group of them working together, they're going to just far outpace people who are outside of that. And I legitimately started to feel that. And, I was like, I feel like I'm kind of being left in the dust here. Like, you guys are crushing and I'm not keeping up. And is it just am I not a good designer? Am I not, are my ideas bad? Whatever. And what I found was they were exponentially kind of pulling each other forward. Right. And I was like, okay, so I actually just need more exposure, because their ideas are developing so much faster because they're right there bouncing them off of each other. And everybody sort of recognized that that's what could start to happen to other people who were working outside of, kind of the main office in Columbus at the time. And so as a way to correct for that, we had some discussions, and we developed something called Studio Freight Research Lab, which is just our weekly team meeting. And at that point, we're talking, that's where we hold our retros. That's where we talk about new project ideas. That's where we talk about, you know, our smooth scroll library, Lenny's, was kind of born out of one of those sessions. Well, it's more complicated than that, but that's where the work gets done, right? In terms of like what Studio Freight as a business kind of puts out into the world. You know, talking about our merch or, you know, a team retreat, whatever. But we also share ideas there too. So if somebody has an idea for a product or an open source project, for example, we'll kind of congregate around those spaces and help each other out. We'll also do like stuff like Figma workshops, or we'll have an illustrator come speak about their process, and sometimes it's discussion based or more like town hall or whatever. But that program for us has really, I think, brought the remote culture together in a way that we'd never really seen before. And so now we have probably, you know, close to 100 under our belt, 100 Studio Freight Research Lab sessions, and that's been such a huge improvement for our culture. And that whole thing has been really based on educating the team and making sure that people have access to the information and the gains that other people are making creatively. So nobody's really like outpacing anybody else, right? We're all sort of sharing this. We're all drinking from the same fountain, so to speak.
All learning together and all growing together.
Exactly. And then we also do Friday learnings too. So we rotate through the studio, and each person is responsible for putting together a presentation on a topic that they've learned about or want to teach the team about. So there's also this culture of teaching that's here as well. And that has a lot to do with things like soft skill development. You know, I think, and our devs are not like this, but in a lot of cases, devs get to go hide in corners. They don't ever have to like present to people who are not other developers. Our developers are not like that at all. They're all excellent public speakers. They all speak at least 2 languages. And they are describing really complicated concepts in a language that's not native to them. And I would put any of them up against any person in our studio any day. Like they're incredible at what they do, but they also have like really great presentation skills and communication skills too. And that's something that is a studio effort, and we all kind of put in that together.
I have been struggling with Rogue to kind of figure out the dynamics of our kind of very broad digital culture. So the breakdown of Rogue is on the face and founder, and then our is Nathan, and he's an Australian who lives in Tokyo with his wife. So that's a 14-hour time difference.
That's
so
pretty big.
Yeah, he's a night owl, so he's chatting with me at like 8, 9, 10 a.m. and it's like really late for him. He has a young kid and another on the way, so that's kind of the time that he sets aside to work. So it works for us in that regard. But trying to bring in that sense of culture and community has been kind of a challenge. And I do love the idea of like the learnings in the town halls. Our kind of fun passion project way that we tend to do kind of this same kind of culture motif is our Jam of the Week series, where we just choose a piece of music and make a custom piece of art and throw it up on Dribble or The World or social media and just kind of jam together, talk about it, and kind of listen to some music and have a little bit of chill time. And that's been like a nice kind of release because there's no stakes. Sometimes you're beating your head against the wall, but you have to do it if it's your week. So you're just not, I guess, buckle up and just do it. But some are good and some aren't. And yeah, ultimately it's like been a fun way to do it. But I like the idea of teaching and constantly growing your skills and presentation skills and the education, because we all need to be learning, and we're probably all doing it individually and don't know how much we have to share with others that aren't at the same level because we've just done more work in one area than another.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been such a huge benefit, because for us, there are things that the developers specifically are always talking about that most of us it just never comes into our worlds, you know, like it have no reason to. We're, you know, designers specifically are always kind of looking in kind of the same places over and over again, but having that different perspective, or even like we have, you know, a couple of scientists on the team, or most recently an anthropologist, right? Like she's coming from a totally different world than we are. So her influences, her background, her worldview is so unique. And so having that unique perspective, kind of thrown into the ring, it just changes the landscape of how we talk about things and what ideas the team is exposed to. Like our last learning was done by Clement Roche. And he talked about like principles and laws and like cognitive biases and things. And it just always stokes this really great conversation. Are we experiencing some of these things? Like, where do you see that happening at Studio Freight? What comes to mind when X, Y, and Z? And so it also just like gives people a reason to talk about something other than work, right? And
Yeah.
it's like the music thing at Rogue, for example, right? Like if we're only ever talking about project stuff, that's so fatiguing. Even though we really love it, it just is still work, And I don't think that, we definitely don't take the perspective of like, this is a family, because I think that's, we don't really like that. But we can be friends here and we can be cordial with each other and share and exchange things that aren't just about pixels. And I think that strengthens us.
I would have to agree. It's all the stuff besides the projects. It always feels good when you're winning and you're putting out something and it's well received. But I mean, having that kind of water cooler talk has been so kind of essential for business for so long that
Yeah.
going completely digital takes a lot of that out of it and kind of divides us a little bit. And so having that opportunity to connect on something besides work, to shoot the shit, to talk about a movie or anything is just so like relaxing and culture building.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you be willing to kind of go even one step deeper into your freight labs?
So this was a fun thing when it first started, right? Like the whole idea was like, let's just have a session, right? And I think it was literally called Studio Freight sessions or just learnings or something at the very beginning. And I'm always looking for these little opportunities to build out little sub brands for the stuff because we don't have like a brick and mortar location for everybody to go. Like we have offices, but there's no like Studio Freight like compound or whatever. So I want us to kind of think of it as like it's like a mental space, right? So when you enter that mental space, you have this thing in mind, you have this image in your head of what it is. So we gave it a brand. It's like based off of the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory identity. So we use like Eurosteel and like red and white and like grids and like monoface or monospace typefaces and stuff like that. And so the whole thing feels like it's like more rigid and more structured, and it's just about like it's about research, and it's a clear space for us to put the ideas into. And so oh God, at this point we've done so many of them. There's a huge list and a huge backlog. So it started out with me just kind of like pulling everybody through it. Like, I want to talk to you guys about stuff that's not project related. Like, let's just talk about these ideas. Like, I want to tell you about like this sculptor that I really admire and whatever. Or let's do a Figma tutorial. Like, let's just put auto layout best practices to rest, right? Let's figure out what our creative strengths are through this like workshop that the Figma blog recently published or something. Like, we'll work through things like that. And not everybody's expected to participate in those things. We're sort of the mindset, if you don't need to be there, like, don't be there. If you have other things to work on, this is not a priority, but this is something that we enjoy doing. And the hope is that people will start to like put into that, right? So they'll suggest ideas, or they'll come to me and say, hey, PT, I want to lead a workshop, or I want to like walk people through this thing. Can we carve out space to do that? And so, I mean, the answer is always yes, right? And so, so yeah, the first couple sessions were a little rough, and I think the reaction to that from the partner team was like, is this like worth the time? And I was like, let's let it evolve into something, and let's figure out what it needs to become. I'm not a fan of like over planning for things like that are culture specific, because I think the people participating will naturally change and evolve it into what it needs to be for them, right? But that means that we still have to have guidelines around it, right? So at first, it was every Thursday. It's an hour and a half. We don't have to take the time. And there's a little bit of pressure around the programming for it too, right? Like, it's just like this on top of everything else. But if we sit down at the beginning of every quarter and kind of plan them out, it becomes a lot easier to do that.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there's that, and then there's also Studio Freight Dark Room, which is all of our. So the Dark Room was born out of Studio Freight Research Lab. We just like gave that brand a little brother, and then that's where like all of our dev stuff lives, right? All of our dev projects. So all of our open source projects are there. Like we'll talk about those in SFRL as well. And so that's like another room that you can enter, right? In this like building that's like kind of on the internet or whatever. You can go into the Studio Freight dark room and see like the development teams like ASCII tool, right? And you can go to GitHub and fork that, clone it, and use it on whatever project you're working on. We're working on several right now, actually. Obviously, we have the smooth scroll library. Like all those things are kind of being worked on over there. And so those projects are all, it's a kind of this like list of little worlds that are waiting to be branded, right? So as we're working through client projects, if there's space, we'll say, okay, ID, we're going to go over and we're going to knock out a brand for Aniso, for Lenny's, for Hamo, for Satis, like all these things that the dev team are working on. They've built the tools. Let's give them this identity so we can go share that with the rest of the world. And it's more than just a GitHub banner or something, right? And that's very much how we think about it, because like I said, there's no building that we get to walk into, but we can kind of create that headspace for everybody. And also just like as excuse to just make dope shit and like fun little graphics and experiment like new stuff like 3D and Blender. And then maybe that stuff works its way into a project. And so there are these little incubators that kind of live for us to test and try things with like zero like issues around failing. You know, like we crash and burn ideas all the time, but we do that in a space that protects it from like client projects and the studio reputation. We'll stress test things, and then we'll say, okay, now that we know this, we're going to bring this into a client project because it's sort of been stress tested.
So Lennis is huge. I mean, it has its own song now, which is pretty amazing. That's how I knew you liked music, because someone at the Freight team was just like, fuck, let's hire a hip hop producer and a rapper and just do this thing. Sorry I missed that one, but that's pretty amazing.
So Jeremy Claudio, he is one guy that does all the music for he's so talented, man, it's ridiculous. So we'll need like this electronic jungle beat on something, but then we'll need like a boom bap hip hop track for something else. Like he's like probably one of the most versatile creative people I've ever met. And he just knocks it out of the park every single time with such limited input too. We'll be like, it's like S1.E1 meets like Portishead. And he's like, I know exactly what you mean. And then he'll come back with sketches, and then we'll choose something, and then he'll take that and like polish it up and like kind of cater it to the animation or whatever. But yeah, Lennis is that's our baby for sure. It's been used on some of the biggest stuff out there on the web right now. We're super proud of it. And that's like one of those things where it was like, it's a tool that the developers are working on, and one of us had the idea to like kind of bring it to the surface a little bit more, give it a brand, give it some language, give it some vocabulary, build a microsite kind of showcasing the features, not too dissimilar from what Locomotive had done with Locomotive Scroll. But I think our superpower is like dev and design, like how those things really go together, and brand, and how those things really come together. And so like this was a clear, like it was clearly obvious that we needed to do that. And now it's being used on like Absolute Vodka, L'Oreal, Spotify. Like half the projects on the awards homepage right now are using the Lenny Smooth Scroll library. The new Oppenheimer site is using it. We're all very excited to see that. So it's cool because our fingerprints are all over the web in this way that we never imagined without us ever touching them, right?
Yeah. And is your intention to keep things open source? Are you going to go subscription down the road, or do you like the idea of having this kind of free library and kind of continuing that, I guess, internal studio ideology of always be growing and learning and sharing? Is that kind of your decision around the open source?
So we've been super passionate about open source from the beginning, but I didn't really have a way to contribute to that in a meaningful and in a substantial way until we built out the development team at the studio. And that was really born out of their efforts, right? But Like, for example, and when I was in college, my college thesis was around open source, like totally open source, like browser tools, hardware tools, etc., all of that stuff. And so I've personally always been really open to that, because here's the thing about free tools and open source is it always kind of looks like trash, right? It just looks like something that's like malware. And so for us, because we're interested in quality and aesthetics, what if we started to like make things that felt a lot more legitimate to not just like developers who know what they're looking at, but also people kind of on the outside too, right? And so that whole thing has really been open to like the Webflow community, for example. Like those people are not hardcore developers, but if they see something that throws out the signal, like a Lenny's, for example, like maybe they'll go check it out and use it, and maybe they'll get excited by this little world that we built for it. And I think they have, you know. But to answer your question more directly, I think that the things that we built that are open source will always remain open source. I don't think we'll never close that door on those projects. But I think it's also been a really great testing ground for us too, to understand how we might develop a tool or a product for a subscription model in the future. What does maintenance look like? What does feedback look like? What does iteration look like? You know, all of those things are potential testing beds for us to really understand the scope of what it takes to accomplish something like that. So, you know, we're working on some stuff in the background right now. I can't talk about it quite yet, but yeah, Lenny's will always be free, or at least a version of it. There's no plan in the immediate future to like put that behind a paywall. It doesn't make sense to do that in its current form at all. And I think we're also just like really committed to the idea of open source. And, you know, we use open source tools like Blender and like a ton of other stuff on the dev side for our projects. And we want to give back. And so that's a way for us to do it.
I'm super passionate and also super intrigued by studios making shit for the sake of making shit, either because they need it internally or because they want to. And it takes me like years of thinking and sitting around on ideas to actually do them. Like Brews and Brews came out in 2021, I believe, but I had that idea in like 2017 or 2018, and it took that long. And to not light the fire under my ass, but to realize that it was a good enough idea that people would be excited and interested. But I don't think that we need to like go through that turmoil in that process and give yourself the permission. You should just shut up, give yourself the permission, and just do it, because there's always going to be someone who needs it or wants it or thinks it's cool. Because if you think it's cool, then there's enough people out there that will have that similar mindset.
Totally. I'm a big believer in just like build it and then figure out what to do with it. You know, because there have been so many times in my career specifically where I've been sitting on an idea and then somebody else built it, and then I'm just kind of kicking myself in the ass for being like, man, I would have done that better, and now it looks like I just want to improve on somebody else's thing. And you know what I mean? So I think that there's, you know, but it's also realistic that you're running a business and don't have time to do that stuff as well, you know. And as we sort of grow, we want to make sure that we create space for people to be able to work on those things in a way that contributes to like the studio's perspective on these tools and working methods, because that says something to prospective clients. It says something to your peers about what you believe in. And I think that like if we have nothing, we have a perspective and we have a point of view on how we view all of this shit. And I think it's super valuable for us to be talking about that and having the conversation, because it makes us stronger and it helps other people too.
I think perspective is kind of everything. I mean, our own personal perspectives give, I guess, like light to the work that we make, why it's unique to us, and why someone else can't kind of possibly make the same thing unless they're intentionally ripping something off. But I've always found that even when I'm trying or aspiring to be like someone else, I feel like my influences and kind of things that I'm kind of vibing with at all different moments in time kind of collide together to make something that feels extremely new. I guess I'm curious about your kind of personal interests or hobbies, and I guess things that are outside of work that kind of fuel you up, and how they kind of correlate to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't have a lot of free time, as you can imagine. I'm sure you don't either, right? Like as a As a business owner, and maybe you have a family too. I'm actually not sure.
I have a wife, and we're just chilling on Cape Cod trying to be beach bums right now.
That's cool. That's rad. So outside of work, let's see. I spend a lot of my time either reading or pretty into fitness, right? So I started running a couple
Oh
of
yeah.
years ago, and like during the pandemic, I live in New York City, so I live in Manhattan, which means like limited access to the outside world. That's not just hot concrete all the time, but I live super close to Central Park. And so we spent as much time outside in the parks as we could during COVID. And I said to my partner, I was like, I wish I was like that guy that just like ran, you know what I mean? Like just out at like 5 a.m., just crushing miles. And she was like, well, what's stopping you? You know? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I just like don't really see myself that way. And so she was like, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens, you know? And so we started running in August of 2021, 2020. Yeah, August of 2020. And no, it was 21, sorry. And I just never stopped. I was like, I became obsessed with like, I got an Apple Watch, was like kind of the big like eye opener for me, because I started to see like analytics on my body, and I was like, this is cool. I really like that part of it. And so then I became kind of obsessed with like the technical part of it, right? Like how can I increase my mileage and my use of like blood oxygen and all that stuff, and really just became addicted to it. And then I started climbing and doing some cross training in the gym, and I found this thing that ended up being like just totally life changing for me, which was like I was a better thinker. I was like more clear minded. I was in a better mood. Like it just like totally changed what was happening up here in a way that I'd never really experienced like as an adult. And as like an aging dude too, like stuff starts to hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Like getting out of bed, and I think that just comes as a result of like I've been sitting down working on Studio Freight for like 7 years and not really moving a ton, and so yeah, it really kind of changed everything for me, and it got me to like see a new side of the city and just got me out and about a lot more. And so that's a big part of my life now is fitness and making sure that like I'm taking care of myself and taking care of my body. Outside of that, I read a lot. I love retro gaming, right? So I got one of those like handhelds. And so like that's really fun for me too. Like every once in a while, kind of in between things. And then I do a lot of like I consider myself like a 3D hobbyist, right?
Okay.
So I mentioned Blender earlier. I downloaded Blender in like the winter of 21, and I'd never really done much 3D work and just became totally hooked. I was working with a 3D artist on a project a few years ago, and I was just doing some helicopter art directing on a couple things, and I was watching him model. And I was like, yo, man, if I knew how to do this, it's like all I would do. And he was like, modeling is so fun. And I was just like, dude, just like a Twitch streamer. I just want to watch you make shit in 3D. Like, this is so fascinating to me. And later that year, I just downloaded Blender because it was free, and I just like became like totally, it's like a thing, like Blender's a cult, and like I'm totally in that cult now. And the community is awesome. The open source thing is cool. Like it's super technical, and so we use it on some projects sometimes. But like like if you were asking me like what I was doing on a Thursday night, like I'm probably just like messing around. Like I'm either running or like messing around in Blender. So.
I love that. I'm very big on hobbies. I'm very big on fitness. You would never be able to tell looking at me, but like I'm weight training or doing some sort of like calisthenics generally like 6 days a week. And that's probably what I'll be doing like after this call is like doing some sort of workout. So like that's my way of continuing to be like mentally clear every single day. And if I don't get like my workout in, it's like probably a 10% less good day. I won't say worse because it's probably a good day, but definitely clear mind. The just kind of like endorphins and energy that you get as a result of it is amazing. And I that's what I'm addicted to. It's not the vanity, it's just the feeling and the energy and the longevity and how it kind of affects my life on a day-to-day basis. So start a running practice if you're out there listening, or get to the gym. Do something for yourself. You deserve it, really.
It honestly, like, I never really understood how good you actually felt after like a real workout. Like once you kind of get over that hump of like this hurts and it's hard,
Mm,
like once your body can kind of tolerate it, when you can, like, if you can run for an hour, which is a lot, like come on, that's like a lot.
yeah.
If you can do that, like coming out of that, I mean, you kind of feel invincible. um and then you're going to sleep like a baby too, and I need that, because there's so much going on. My head is always, it's constantly going. So I need to like wear myself out, and having a fitness routine has like, it's been totally transformational for me. And I try not to be that guy, you know what I mean, that's always like talking
Mhm.
about like the gym or working out or whatever. Because I really do it for myself, and I do it more for my mental state than I do the physical state. And it just so happens that there are a lot of great benefits, obviously, that come along with that physically. So, what about you? Are you a runner? Are you exclusively weight training? What's your thing?
So I have a knee injury that I don't really know why, but it like constantly feels like my knee is almost like hollow. So a lot of running doesn't do me any favors. But I there's a ultimate frisbee community here on Cape Cod. So like I'll do like the short bursts of running and play some ultimate frisbee with those guys. But I'm pretty much 5 days a week doing some sort of weight training, and I have like a weight rack in the closet, so I just do it
Nice.
here. Um, and then when I feel like doing something outside, I might even just like do some sort of like hit workout in the park or the beach, just because it beautiful scenery beats being in your or apartment or your house to do a
Totally.
workout for sure.
That's awesome. Has that propagated through your studio? Like, are other people inspired by that? Like, Britton, oh man, he's out there putting the work in. Like, I gotta at least go for a walk.
I feel like I feel like they either don't care or sometimes I'll like mention something and people will be like, "Oh, I should really do that." Like I haven't done anything this week. So like I feel like after this call I'm definitely going to try to encourage it for their own well-being again and again, especially Nathan, who's on the computer just like solving bugs or coding all day. Uh generally at night, so maybe during the day when his daughter's at kindergarten, maybe he can go and enjoy himself. But we do work with a contractor, Jackie Cow, and she's big into weight training. She's an LA native but lives in Copenhagen with her husband.
Nice.
And so we talk about gym rat shit a lot generally. And I mean, to tie it back to culture again, that's like something that I've been trying to do because our core team is Nathan and myself, and we work with a lot of contractors. Is I always try to bring in someone who's not male or not or just is ethnically diverse in some degree that can kind of influence the studio through a different culture, and that can just be hiring someone from anywhere in the world to kind of give us a different perspective to influence like the greater studio at large and to contribute their own kind of ideas and ideology. And I'm really big on that now, so I try to work with as many people that I can and try to make it a diverse community. Because where I live currently is not moving from New York to Cape Cod. There's not a lot of diversity. So that is something that I try to find and crave and encourage. And it's been really transformative here.
That's good. Yeah, that's great to hear. It's super important, and it's tough because I think there's because of that, because of how things have kind of been built in our industry. I think a lot of people who don't look like us are deterred from being in the space to begin with, or don't have the tools or knowledge to like reach out in the ways that we hope that they
Mhm.
would. And it's super hard to find people, like it's not like we have a constant barrage of the most ideal candidates, like whatever boxes those check,
Mhm.
assaulting our inbox at all times. Like it just like
Mhm.
isn't like that. And I also too really wanted to feel like the work that we put out and produce like I just don't want it to look like it's a bunch of white dudes making decisions in an office. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just like
Yeah.
it should just be more aware than that. And it's not to say
Mhm.
like, yeah, like let's lean into like visual stereotypes or something, you know, like obviously
Mhm.
like that's offensive for its own, you know, in its own way. But like I just don't want it to ever feel like, oh, we know this perspective, like we've seen this before. And our team is not that, you know, and the work shouldn't be representative of that. And I don't ever want our team to be that. So you do have to put the effort in to like qualify and disqualify the talent that comes through and who you choose to hire. Like we work with people, so many different people all over the world from different backgrounds. And once we opened up our studio, like post COVID, it just like the different types of people that we've worked with, they just could never have imagined it. Because like, you know, like I said, we started the studio in Columbus, Ohio, not the most diverse place in the world. Like it just isn't, you know. Where inversely New York is like it's kind of the opposite of that in a lot of ways. But our mindset is like it actually doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. Like it's about the work, it's about the pixels, it's about the ideas that you throw down, and that's ultimately what matters. And like, do you give a shit? Are you interested in what we're doing here? Like, that's great. Let's go.
Yeah, hell yeah. That is the way to be. I think, especially with the kind of floodgates of remote work and kind of the shifts in kind of company cultures. I would hope that the idea of like borders in kind of our digital culture would collapse and you just work with people who are just amazingly kick ass at what they do and want to be there and show up each day and like you said, throw down and just do the work and do it damn well. Like that's what matters to me. It sounds like that's what matters to you and probably a lot of other people out there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're always trying to have conversations with other studio owners around how they build like that. And you know, even people that we interview recently, there was this person we were interviewing for a junior design position, and she just hit me with the hardest question that anybody. She asked the best questions of anybody that I've ever interviewed. She's like 6 months out of school, and one of her question was, "How does Studio Freight like prioritize diversity, and not just in terms of like, and how do you view it, and not just in terms of like gender or racial ethnicity?" And I was like, that is such a complex question. Um, I'm glad that you asked. And you know, you know, our point of view on that is like we really try to approach this stuff knowing that like different worldviews are super important because like we get a lot wrong. You
Mhm.
know, like we've done where, you know, one thing that comes to mind is we had recently just finished up with this sorry, we recently just finished this project that was going to be built and viewed in China, and and just like as like dumb Americans, there's just so much that comes to your head when you think about like China culturally. And so like we're constantly trying to vet like the images and the ideas and the motifs against like what's appropriate, because like I actually don't know what's offensive. Like there's some stuff that Americans would look at and say like you can't include like koi fish. Let's go with something generic or like that,
Mhm.
right? Like that feels like a stereotype to Americans, but like when we present a spectrum of ideas, like the client is like, that I want that, like that's amazing, like I love your take on this, let's go with that. So you know, we are somewhat sensitive and saying like, is that cliche, is that shitty that we're even throwing it out in the first place? And they're like, no, like we should definitely have rabbits because it's the year of the rabbit and we take that seriously, and that's like part, you know what I mean, like
Mhm.
just listening and being okay with being wrong and being okay with like accepting the fact that your worldview is limited is like really how we have to think about it. You know, a lot of our team members are international at Studio Freight, right? Like we've got people in Belgium and France and Spain and Argentina and Mexico, you know, and like American perspectives in a setting like that can be. I always say that we're like the Texas of the world. And you know exactly what I mean by that
Yeah.
because you're American, right? So,
Yeah.
or you're here anyway. And it's just always like our perspective is right, and like we have a hard time seeing things from other people's like points of view. And if as long as we're just like conscious of that and being okay with being wrong about stuff sometimes and being humble about that, you know, we can move forward peacefully and constructively.
Yes. Yeah. And definitely the constructively. And that's why I find it so fascinating to work with like people from all different places. Like our designer who tackles a lot of the 3D stuff that we do is in South Africa. And he's kind of dealing with the kind of crazy political turmoil down there and
Right.
their lack of energy. And so it got to a point where a project where he just like didn't have 12 hours of electricity like in a day. So that was cut off to him. So we just like basically couldn't work. So we had to kind of like figure out a game plan and a shift from there. But ultimately, like my concern is like that he's taken care of and he has the ability to feel
Yeah.
like he's contributing while dealing with his life and circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. Super important. You know, we were having conversations. We were working with this client, and they had a remote culture, right? It's this big like fintech company, and they had started assembling this incredible design team.
Hmm.
And I won't name names here because it ultimately doesn't matter. And we were talking about like how they thought about hiring or whatever, and they had hired this person who you've definitely seen on Twitter. You definitely follow this person on Twitter, and it was sort of like we discovered that this person was like kind of in the middle of um, the Ukraine conflict, right? And it was just like holy shit, like people are working through that. Like they have, you know, it's like, yeah, they have a job and a life, and there's like other things happening in the world, and it's so easy to take your situation that we're in here for granted,
Hmm.
and in stuff like that, it's complicated, but you know, we figure it out together, and you just have to be open to people's situations because it's just it's not as simple as it can be here. Um, so yeah, I applaud you for figuring that out and being empathetic to those folks, you know, in South Africa and so on, because they're valuable people, and just because they're in a situation that they don't necessarily have control over shouldn't disqualify them from having access to opportunities.
Yeah, 100%. Regardless of where they are in the world, that kind of applies. I wanted to, if, and this is a question open to discussion, but pivot a little bit to turning off your brain at night. We don't have a ton of time. We're exercising. We're both reading. So I'm curious what you're reading and if you're reading it for pleasure or to just have another activity to turn your brain off and be able to fall asleep at night, because that's what a lot of my reading is. And so I guess two-part questions. What are you reading, and is it mainly for fun or knowledge and growing?
I almost never read for fun.
So we're the same.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my book collection is like 90% nonfiction, and I go in and out of like being kind of obsessive with reading. So whenever the studio is facing like potentially an inflection point or a challenging time, like I'll just crush every book that's ever been recommended to me or anything that's like relevant to the situation at hand or like something that I'm trying to anticipate. Or like something that I'm just trying to get better with. You know, for example, like right now I'm reading books on leadership, right? And that means a lot of things. So there's a few things. Like I just read Rework by DHH from Basecamp, and I'm reading something on leadership from like the Carnegie Institute right now. That's kind of in like the regular rotation. But my pursuit of knowledge is constant, right? And so that's like a series of YouTube videos and documentaries and articles. You know, the founder of Y Combinator publishes these really extensive blog posts. You know, that's something that I'm reading through right now. But I almost never read for pleasure. You know, there's some stuff that I really love in my past, but I think I got to a certain point where I was like, I'm going to use reading and books as a way to absorb knowledge and to try to become a more well-rounded person, a better leader, you know, a better manager, a better business person, a better partner, you know, like all those sorts of things. So reading is purely utility for me. I take it super seriously. Like, you know, notes in the margins, highlighter, like the whole thing, like it's a project in and of itself, like this pursuit of knowledge. That and like my body and my mind, like those are things that that are I kind of think of them as projects outside of work. So I almost never read at night because of that, because of the type of thing that I'm reading, and that'll just get me like too anxious and excited about like solving
Oh, yeah.
problems. So
Hmm.
I tend to do my reading mostly in mornings, and over the weekend I'll try to get like, crush some stuff there. But yeah, in terms of turning my brain off, I just have to exhaust myself, man. I've just, ever since I was in school, like they I don't know if you went to school, but if you went to design school or art school or whatever, like there's so much pressure that they put on you because like you're going to a creative field, like so few people take you seriously to begin with, so you have to work twice as hard, and they just pound that into you. So it just, for me, it never really left, right? So and then starting the studio too, there's always been this pressure around like if you're sitting, like you could be working right now, and if you're not working, your business is like slowly like losing health, right? It's super unhealthy, but it's like that's the thing that's kind of pounded into me. So as a result of that, I have all of this energy and I just have to like totally exhaust myself. So I work a lot, I run a lot, I read a lot, and by the time I get to like my bedtime is like midnight EST, like I just crash, and then I sleep for maybe 5 hours, and then I'm back at it.
Yeah, we're pretty much the same. I have two questions for you. One is what's your favorite book on leadership that you would recommend? The second question is, where did this kind of pursuit of knowledge come from? Did it start in design school and never leave, or was it even before that?
I'll answer the second one first because I have to think about the book question. I actually have to like look at my books. Um, yeah, okay. So the second question, where did the pursuit of knowledge come from? Um, so I grew up in a really, really poor part of the world, and my background is like, not very many people in my family went to college, and they're good people, but they sort of seem to be kind of stuck in that place.
Mm.
And I just never saw myself being stuck in that place. And I found that the more that I put into myself, the more leverage I had to get myself out of that place, out of those positions. And to me, that meant school. To me, that meant, and this was kind of something that I learned from skateboarding, which was like this relentless pursuit of improvement and being okay with failure, because that just means I'm one step closer to like landing, sticking the landing or whatever. And so it really just became a ticket for me out of my situation. And so it became routine, right? And so, okay, if I invest in myself more and more, if I'm a smarter, better, if I'm a smarter person, if I'm a better speaker, if I'm better organized, if I'm thoughtful, and I'm polite, that does something for me, and it takes me out of this place. Like I'm clearly not a fit in this one place, right? Because I seem to be of another place, and that's the place I'm always trying to go. And as things become more complicated with like starting a business and getting a degree and trying to like build a culture, like those problems become more complex too, right? So
Mhm.
now I have the obligation of having to be a step or two ahead of everybody in order to be like, this is where we're going and this is what I think that we should be doing. And I rely on my partners a lot for that too, right? Like we have a really tight partner team, and they're all super smart people, and Studio Freight would not exist without all four of them for sure. So I don't mean to take too much credit there, but it's also putting yourself around like-minded, ambitious people too, right? And ambitious people, they just don't stop, and when that becomes kind of the culture, then it just becomes second nature. And for me, like I love museums, I love documentaries, I love arts, like I love traveling. It just is the way that I am now. I guess it's always kind of been there now that I think about it. But the best book on leadership, it's not even a book about leadership. This is it's such a weird answer because it sounds so corny and it's so old, but it's got to be Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? It's like
Mhm.
one of
Mhm.
those quintessential books about like just being out in the world and whatever. It's such a good book, and it, again, like it sounds so corny, right? But it was written in the 30s. Dale Carnegie was super, super successful with his like Carnegie Institute and his programs and all of that. But it's like if you were to, you could just Google you don't even have to read the book, right? Because a lot of the examples are so old. Like it'll be like the the CEO of General Electric in
Yeah.
like 1845 or whatever, like, or it'll like reference Cher or something because they tried to update it in the 80s or whatever.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter what the examples are. The principles that are contained within that book are so fundamental and so dead simple that now it seems really obvious. But if you just consider those things, I'll give you an example in a second. It's just like, this is clearly how I should just be treating people. And it just helps so much. So one of them is be genuinely interested in other people. Right. And I think this is more relevant now than it really has been in decades with like social and just this weird place that this has all become,
Mm-hmm.
there's like so much self-importance on people that people put on themselves now. But if you could like legitimately sit down and say like, I care and I think that I want to know more about you and who you are as a person, and just I genuinely want to listen to you, like the response to that is it can be life altering. And it's a lot of simple things like that, like remember and use people's names. um Demonstrate empathy is like kind of the crux of the whole thing. And I think that it's easy for people to kind of forget the fundamentals of what it's like to actually engage with others. And I think that book is a good reminder, as corny as it may seem, but it's like, it's going to be $5. It's going to be at every used bookstore. And there's just a tremendous amount of knowledge in that little list of 10 principles or whatever it is. I cannot recommend that book enough. And you might cringe going through some of the sections, but you could just Google the thing. I think it's more impactful to read them in context too. So.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. No, that's one that I haven't read yet, so I'm excited to dive in. I like to get recommendations and kind of run to the local bookstore and see if I can dig through the bargain bin and dust off the pages and read something that's truly like a gem.
Yeah,
That's always
that's definitely one of them for sure.
nice. That's always been my favorite thing about record stores, bookstores, is just kind of like looking for the nuggets of treasure. Is that something that you still do, or are you kind of like diving at the recommendations from friends, or kind of looking for a specific piece of knowledge?
So I'll go off of recommendations a lot. Like a partner will mention something, or I'm a part of a couple of like Slack groups and somebody will bring something up, or I'll listen to a podcast and they'll mention a book. And I think at this point, like I've read a lot of the big hitters that are kind of out there in like the productivity category. But something I did really early on in the life of Studio Freight is I just emailed every shop that I admired. I would just find the owners, the principals, like email address, usually by guessing. So like, Britain at rogue.studio or whatever. And then I would just send my questions. I would be like, hey, super love what you're doing. I'm starting something. Here are 3 questions that I have. And 9 times out of 10, they'd be like, let's get on a call. That was always on my list. Like, what books should I be reading? And something that was recommended to me from one of the partners at OMFG Co. was, what is it called? Implementing value-based pricing. It's like a textbook. It's super. It's like 600 pages. It's like fucking 10-point type. It's massive. And he was like, that book will change how you think about charging and like how to like build that into your business. And I read it cover to cover and just studied the whole thing and was just so drawn into it. And like ever since then, I was like, I'm just going to take every recommendation that other owners and other people that I respect make, and I'm gonna crush it in a couple of days. I'm gonna take extensive notes and then figure out how I can like move on to the next thing. I got great book recommendations from Brian Collins like that, from Collins. Right? Like I was like, what do I need to be reading? He was like, this, and this. And come back to me when you finish those books because I have more for you. And I don't know if you know much about them or him, but like their studio, it's half of it is a library. Like it's all books, because it matters that much to them and their culture, which I think is super cool. But I've got a massive list that I've been building that way over the years. So my Amazon book list, and it's, I'm probably 100 books deep and 100 books of book debt.
But I wanted to jump into art. You had mentioned that super into art. I would hope so as a designer, as a creative. But if there is a jumping off point, whether it's a style or a artist that you really love, because we'll go back to Kendrick Lamar later and talk about that. But if there was an artist, who is it that really, really kind of lights a fire under you and kind of ignites your passion for art in general?
Britain, come on, man. No,
It's a good one, but it's a fucking hard one.
it's fucking
Like,
hard. It's fucking hard because there are so many artists, like especially like throughout my life, that have really changed the way that I think about the world. And you know, like I'm one of those people that like I love people who are disruptors and just like totally fuck up the game. So I'll kind of go off a little bit here, but like for one of those people for me, you know, someone that's somewhat controversial is Marcel Duchamp, right? The fountain, the idea of like the ready-made and all these things. And, you know, people look at that piece, the fountain, and they're like, well, he didn't do anything, right? Like he didn't make this. But what people are usually missing out of that is the context in which that was done and what Duchamp was trying to say. Because like he was an incredible painter, he was an incredible sculptor and craftsman. Like he's like one of the most important figures in analytical cubism, right? So we're talking about in one of the most extremely technical like categories of painting. Chose not to do it, instead did this other thing, and it totally fucked up the art world, and nobody knew what to do with it, and we're still talking about it. That's really interesting to me, and that's the art of it, right? Like the piece doesn't even exist anymore, but the idea does, and that's what he was trying to do. And to me, that's really fascinating. And I think a lot, and you know, everybody loves Picasso because he's Picasso, and that's fine. You know, there's a lot of great Picasso work, and his career is more fascinating to me than like any individual work. But it's the people that really kind of change my view that I really appreciate. I feel the same way about Jackson Pollock as I do Duchamp, right? Where it's like, you know, the splatter on the canvas, like we get it, whatever. And, you know, the same argument. And I'm like, you don't understand, like at that time, this person was contextualizing something that nobody had any idea what to do with. And it just changed how we defined that thing. And that's the art. And yes, there's beauty in like Number 6 and all the Untitled stuff that he did and whatever your opinion is on it. But like the act itself is the thing that I'm so like profoundly impacted by. And that's the thing that kind of lingers in my head. And that's what I think about when I go see that piece at MoMA or something, right? Like kind of sitting on that big sofa in front of that painting and just kind of living in that headspace. I get to just kind of be there for a minute. And that's what's really special about it to me. But in a more contemporary way, I feel like this is such a cliche answer, but I have to say it. Like Tom Sachs is huge for me, and for a number of reasons. So when growing up, I was my dad was a general contractor and a carpenter, right? And so what that meant was I grew up on a construction site. And so as being a creative little kid, I'm like building stuff with the leftover scraps and the materials and what's trash, right? And just like figuring out how to make little things and drawing on the inside of the walls of the houses that we're working on, you know, kind of behind the drywall, behind the walls or whatever, like skulls and fucking, you know, like graffiti or whatever, with like carpenter's pencils and stuff. And you know, at some point, something interesting comes out of that, and you're sort of it's called bricolage, right? Like 3-dimensional, like you're kind of like sticking stuff together to make something new, right? Yeah. And you're just kind of doing that stuff, but in this naive way, like not really thinking about it like art, but just like I need to keep my hands busy because I'm such a hyperactive person. and you know, so we have all these things like spray paint for like marking the ground, and pipe, like gas line pipe and PVC and glue and industrial adhesives and screws. And like if I would have thought about this at the time, and I wasn't thinking about it this way, because when you're trained as an artist, to like go to the art store, right? Go to the art supply store and get graphite and get oils and drawing boards and Bristol paper and all that stuff. And at some point it became really clear to me that that's bullshit. And actually you can just go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and like that's also the fucking art store, right? But it just so happens that like spray adhesive at the art store is $25, and at Lowe's it's like $5. It's the same exact thing. So context, right? And industrial adhesives and spray paint, it's all like, it's so cheap at the hardware store. And screws and wood and plywood and 2x4s and, you know, all this stuff. And so then it became like, you know, and that went into like building skateboard ramps and little structures and things like that, right? And so I was kind of making this art before I knew it, and then I put that away. And then years later, I stumbled upon Tom Sachs, and those are the materials and the language and the vocabulary that he's using to make this high value art that's at like Sotheby's or Aquavella Gallery or part of the permanent collection at MoMA or Guggenheim, right? Like he's using the materials that look like the shit that I grew up with on the job site, and that blew my mind. And it was, you know, he's also kind of coming from it from like a he's coming at it from like a skateboard street art sort of perspective too. And you know, like what other artist out there collaborates with Nike on a shoe? Like an artist has a shoe, it doesn't make sense. So there's this, you know, he's a welder, he's a sculptor, you know, he does like pinch pot clay things, and he puts his studio and his viewers and his crew in this, like in these universes and these mindsets. And it just reminded me so much of what it felt like to like be growing up on that job site and just making shit with the things that I found around me. And so watching somebody build an art career and an art practice out of that was like really, really fucking cool to me. It really made all of those decisions that we were making when I was a kid on the job site, it just changed the way that I thought about it.
I'm glad that you mentioned process and materials too, because I went to the Mass College of Art in Boston,
Yeah.
Strictly to get through the design program and to be a kick-ass designer. And I didn't appreciate all of the other drawing classes or the other sculpture or other classes that I had access to, because I just wanted to do my degree and just be an amazing designer. And it was this retraining of my brain to think about materials and textures and ideas, and know that basically everything is a material, everything is art in its own way, and you just have to interpret it and put that context to it, like you had mentioned, and to come to that understanding of that context is that defining kind of principle in which you view it, that gives it meaning or a message or all of the purpose behind it. One of my favorite things is looking at the materials when I go through a museum and just like, oh, this person's using this ridiculous material that I would have never thought to use. And like, that's what makes it so cool to me. And I'll show people and they're like, looks like a 4-year-old drew it. And it's like, that's not the point. It's like, this was made with this bullshit material or seemingly bullshit material. And it's so beautiful as a result of that, with the, just like a childlike mind or a kind of innovative understanding of what a material could be.
Totally agree. There's a artist, what is his name? Totally blanking. It's analogous to Mark Rothko. Jasper Johns is who it is. Jasper Johns. So he made a lot out of cardboard, right? And cardboard is one of those things that everybody has access to, right? Like it's literally trash, right? And so if you have $10, you could go buy a like a, you know, a bundle of glue sticks and a shitty glue gun from whatever place, right? Hardware store, bodegas probably even have them here. And then just go get that stuff from the trash. And then, you know, somebody like Wayne White, who, you know, this is relevant because Pee-wee just died. He was like the art director on Pee-wee's Playhouse. He's like, he has a full-fledged like art career now, right? Like he's like top tier guy showing in like fancy New York City galleries. He makes puppets out of cardboard, and they're beautiful. They're so well done. And it just takes like a little bit of imagination and a little bit of care and interest and very few materials. And then suddenly like this thing now exists, and it's a manifestation of your ideas and your thoughts and your perspective. And I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person, like my hands can never be still. I always have to be doing something. I mentioned the amber neck earlier, right? Like I always have to be doing something.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've both been wiggling. We've been
yeah.
like, I just play with my hands or spin my ring. Oh, best invention ever, the wedding ring, to just.
Oh, does it spin?
Yeah. It spins around my finger. Maybe that's because I'm not swollen right now, but
I see, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's the beauty of it too, is like finding the reason that you're interested, because it draws you in to investigate a little bit more, and that's the headspace I love to be in, for sure.
I literally just looked over at the counter and there was just a bagel sitting on the counter. And my wife waited 20 minutes for that bagel because she just was craving it so bad. And there's no good bagel shops around here, unlike New York. So my first question is, what's your favorite bagel in the city right now?
Bagel and Schmear. So we have an office on 28th, and it's just right. It's right by the studio, and they burn them. They don't burn them. They like overcook them a little bit because I like my bagels to be cooked again, right? Like
Yeah.
just toasted. It's perfect. It's so good. But I personally just love, like, I'm a sweet dude, so I love cinnamon raisin with plain cream
Mm.
cheese.
My go-to bagel order was everything bagel toasted with regular cream cheese from Court Street Bagels down in Brooklyn. That was
Nice.
my go-to.
Yeah.
But I used to live in Red Hook prior to moving to the Cape back in October. So
Okay.
it was a very heart kind of wrenching, breaking experience, kind of leaving the city, but trying to transition to be beach bums and closer to family. So
Sure.
I definitely am like missing Court Street in general and like the incredible coffee shops down there. Stumptown was like my go-to. What was the coffee that you were drinking today?
Partner, which I
Oh,
believe
nice.
is also based in Brooklyn.
Yeah. They have a spot in Williamsburg. I
Yeah.
think that yeah, I went to that one quite a bit when I was down there.
Yeah, one of our designers picked it up and brought it in one day, and I was like, "This is excellent." And so we used to drink Stumptown before that, and he brought it in the partner coffee, and I've just been hooked.
Yeah, they're super good. Also, like incredibly designed spaces. I feel like that's what I'm looking for. Like great coffee, like a great chill vibe.
Yeah,
Um, oh, like attention to detail in general. Say Coffee in Bushwick. I don't know if you've been there.
yeah.
The whole roof is like a skylight, so it just gets incredible light. It's beautiful.
There's a Devoción in Williamsburg that's kind of like that too.
This is maybe a little bit of a deep question, but I think we all need to reflect at moments. So, what's your what? Oh wow, I can't read. Uh, what advice would you give to your younger self?
How young are we talking here, Britton?
It depends on how far you want to go back, because I guess if I were to tell my younger self as a kid, because I was one of those kids like causing mischief, like trespassing on people's property, like making movies with my friends,
Yeah,
is to never lose your childlike nature and to always keep your creativity as your sole driver. Because there was a period of time where I was just like so focused on the business and making it work that I kind of lost a part of that. And it ended up hurting the business as a result. And we're back on track now. So that's not an issue, but you learn from your greatest mistakes. So I was just kind of curious what you might tell your younger self.
there's two things that come to mind. The first one is ask for things that you want. I think, yeah, and maybe
It's a
it's like
good one.
maybe it's like a Midwest thing, right? You know, we're taught to be so polite, and the humility is kind of like built in, and like you don't want to bother people and you don't want to be rude and all that stuff. But that's just like not. And I'm not saying be rude, but
Mhm.
it's just like really not how things I've found work. You know, especially if you're trying to like build and make something, like you have to be willing to just kind of put aside um, the fear of failure and the fear of no. You just have to just ignore that stuff and just being okay. Like if you want to do work with somebody, you should just DM them, right? Like you have access to anybody at this point in the world. Like you can probably find an email address or a DM or whatever it takes. You know, we have this idea of how the world is supposed to work, and if that means like if you're trying to get a job, for example, like a lot of people are trying to find work right now. It's a super tough landscape out there.
Mhm.
Um, and so, you know, you look on LinkedIn and people, you know, 100, 1,000 people, 2,000 people have applied for this position or whatever. I'm like, just why even bother, right? Because like you're not going to the right place to begin with. So why don't you just find out who the hiring manager is and then just DM them and then, you know, or go higher than them and then like kind of work your way down from there. Ask for things that you want, because the worst thing that's going to happen is they say no or they ignore you, and who cares, you know, like it really is about what is it that you're trying to do, and what are you trying to get out of this, and nobody's going to hand that to you, and you have to be really clear about what it is that you want, but also be open to possibilities. So that's one thing. And the other thing too, the advice I would probably give is, I was in a place in my life when I was young, coming out of high school, when I thought I recognized what opportunity was. And that was for me to like go work at a job that paid kind of okay coming out of school. But really all that was doing was like putting off the harder decision of needing to go to school and do more complicated things. So the payoff was bigger later on, if that makes sense. Right. So to summarize what I mean by that is like, just go do the fucking thing that like you really want to do, and like be okay with just being broke at first, or like not being successful, right? Like investing in yourself, investing in those around you and your skills and your ideas. Like I think a lot of us are afraid to try those things. And I actually don't think that like generations coming up underneath of us have as much of an issue with that as we do or did. But yeah, I would definitely give that advice to my younger self. Like, just dude, you love like creative stuff. Like, why are you working at this construction company? Well, because it pays $30 an hour. That feels like a lot of money. Now I would just rather be broke and doing shit that I like, because I don't want to be miserable.
Exactly. Yeah. Our mental health is wealth, and health in general is wealth. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there's a right way or a wrong way to ask for what you want. I'm sure you get a ton of messages of people trying to find work at Studio Free. From that experience, have you found that there are right ways or wrong ways to ask for what you want?
Oh yeah. That's a great question. So I think what I get a lot is things that feel really templated or shotgun blast. Like I'm one of many, right? It's like this dear hiring manager kind of thing. And like, look, I've sent that email before. You know what I mean? I forgot to replace people's names and stuff before. Like I've gotten all that stuff wrong. And what that ultimately says is like, there's nothing wrong with trying to like automate, right? There's nothing wrong with that, for sure. Like take advantage of those tools and those approaches, for sure. But what it says to me is like, you don't actually think that this matters, or that like your interest in this it's not significant. And like, that's the signal that's being put out. So this goes back to the thing that I was mentioning about the Carnegie thing, right? And like genuinely being interested. And I think like when you're asking for a job or you're asking from advice, what you're really asking for is time from this other person. And what do we have? We have nothing if we don't have time, right? And so one thing that I figured out really early on, and I mentioned this before, was when I sent out my emails to those other studio owners, I just sent all the questions ahead of time. And I didn't like end it on this like open-ended thing, like, hey, I would love to pick your brain. That's like the worst way to approach getting something that you want. Hey, I love what you're doing. I super respect it. I really love this about whatever. I'm starting this. I have questions. If you have time, I would love to get answers to these 5 things, right? So I'm like organized and I'm clear and I'm diligent and I expect nothing. If I get anything, if I even get a response, like that's like now I'm in a surplus of some kind of information, right? Like, oh, I know not to, like, dude, I would like email Pentagram partners and be like, how are you handling the recession? And they're like, I don't have fucking time to talk to you. I'm sorry, but like email me in a year. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And at least I knew that my stuff got through to them, and like I checked that one off the list, move on to the next one. Who else is going to be willing to give me just like one more insight that I didn't have before? And I know ultimately comes down to respect for that person. So how can you demonstrate respect for that person's time? I don't want to waste your time with this open-ended bullshit about picking your brain. I have 5 important questions that I need answers to. Can you give them to me? And most oftentimes people are just like really just excited that you even know that they exist and that you care about what they do. So there's that. And then there's also, sorry to keep going on this, but there's also this idea of like mentorship, right? Like several people in the past have tried to get me to mentor them, and I've had mentors. And the dynamic around that is kind of fucked up, because like what you come out of school with thinking is like, oh, this person is going to do all this stuff for me. They're going to answer questions. They're going to give me answers to what to do next. And it's not like that, right? Like it's kind of the opposite way. So if somebody's taking you on as a mentor, it's my belief that you actually owe them stuff, right? It's you that's taking on the debt because you're in their way, right? So any mentor that I've ever had, I would say, hey, we have this thing that's going on. Like, how did you handle this? Like, I have 10 really like pointed questions for you. And they would give me those answers. And then I would take that along with all the other advice and things I was reading and learning. I would go implement and then come back with a result, right? So I would say, this is how that performed, or like how this worked for us or didn't work for us. Did you experience this? What, whatever, or show them the success. Hey, hey, I took your advice on reading that book that you gave me 5 years ago. Here's a picture of me and the 10 other people I'm now able to employ because of your advice.
That's beautiful.
That shit like rocks people, man. Like I'll respond to the email chain that we had 5 years ago to that one. So it circulates and you see that we've had the conversation before with a picture of my team. And they're like, oh my God, like you actually did something with what I suggested. And that gets you maybe a friendship. So that's what comes to mind. Sorry, that was a lot, but yeah.
No, I love it. I'll take the a lot. So what is your favorite Kendrick Lamar album to date then? To go full circle with it.
Yeah, I know I'm going to take some heat for this. Because the default answer, everybody's answer should be To Pimp a Butterfly. Because that is factually an incredible album. But I think for me, it's Good Kid, Mad City. And I think it's because of when I found that album and when it was like, right, I mean, he was big at that point, like big enough that I obviously knew who he was being in Columbus, Ohio. But, To Pimp a Butterfly wins the Pulitzer. It's like regarded as one of the best ever, obviously, like it sort of solidified his genius. But to me, it's Good Kid, Mad City because it's a little bit more rough around the edges. It's so like he's still got like one foot in Compton in a different way than he did in To Pimp a Butterfly, where it seems like he'd kind of like risen out of that situation. And there's just something about him still trying to figure it out that I think is really interesting about Good Kid, Mad City. And there's this really I mean, this is present in all of his stuff, but like the idea of like skits and like hip hop culture and this self-awareness quality, it's just so different on that album than other things that we had seen. And I think there's just something really interesting about what he was producing before the fame, before like he hadn't gotten the notoriety for that album yet because he was busy writing it, right? And so it's like this really great moment in time before he was actually really big, where it's just like, this has everything I got in it. And then, he solidifies his position with To Pimp a Butterfly, and then Damn comes out, and it's just like, well, I mean, he's just like one of the greatest of all time, obviously. But yeah, I think it's Good Kid, Mad City.
I actually have to agree with you, and I'm not agreeing to agreeing, because that's when I discovered Kendrick from a recommendation of one of my closest friends, and he's a musician himself. I trust his word basically on all music. We grew up together and I kind of got into music as a result of him. So huge influence in my life. But I was on the cusp of kind of discovering hip hop and kind of learning to appreciate the entirety of the hip hop culture and things that I didn't understand about it. So the storytelling on that album in particular is so captivating. And you're so in his world with all of those stories, and they could be true, they could be fictions or other people's stories, but it doesn't matter. You're being told them and they're so captivating, and you're just immersed in that I couldn't like stop listening to it.
Yeah, it's really special. It is like wholeheartedly a concept album, as many of his works are, but I mean, a lot of hip hop albums are concept albums and are and narrative based, obviously. But there was something about the timing too that was really unique around that, I thought. And if you don't know, Invisible Creature did all the album art for that, which I thought was really interesting. Because they'd done like mostly like metal and like rock album covers and stuff. But they did Good Kid, Mad City as well, which I thought that's a cool tie. And like to even think that, you know, a rapper like that would even have somebody like them on their radar, and then be able to execute on something that just feels so right, like that van, the picture of the van, like it's just, it breaks the fourth wall in just every dimension. It's awesome. Like the whole thing is great. I love it.
Yeah, it definitely a home run for sure. But I know you had some questions. That was my kind of furious fast questions there. So I'm going to turn over the interviewee spot and let you kind of interrogate me.
Yeah, so I don't have many, but I want to throw a couple of these back at you. But first, I really want to know, like, obviously you guys just launched a new website, right? So congrats on that. It looks
Thank
awesome.
you.
You guys got to be over the moon.
Man, I was the biggest roadblock of us putting that out. And it's something that I'm glad that I learned from the experience of doing it. I am happy about it, and there's more to come. And I'm excited about the other pieces that are going to be released, like the case studies and the kind of culture page. And where we've kind of pivoted in a way where we're doing more writing. And so there's going to be articles and hopefully YouTube videos connected to those articles. I'm not trying to go full education space, anything like that, but I do have this kind of burning inside of me to give back and to educate. I've done a lot of self-education, and I have asked a lot of others over just like little conversations, and I want to kind of put that back into the world. So that's all coming down the pipeline. And a piece of that is this podcast, trying to open up these little bits of insider conversation that if you were a little bit more timid and shy, or maybe don't even have a little bit of the notoriety, you might not be able to get in the door and have a conversation like this. So I want to kind of put that into the world as well and just share more. So definitely over the moon about the new website. It feels good. I was the roadblock. My developer told me basically to like shut up and put it live, and I took his advice and did it. So feeling good now.
Good. Well, congrats. I hope it does well for you guys. It looks great. So I guess, you know, coming off of that, what big plans do you have within, besides the content piece of it? What else is Rogue up to? What are you guys looking forward to?
That's a great question, because it was like a giant moment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. What's next, right? Like if you're like, God, I'm tired. I need to go take a nap. I can't do anything else besides the client work.
so this is next. But then after that, I'm trying to brew up the next little passion project. It may be a fun microsite for the jam of the week, where we do something and turn like each jam into like a mixtape or something and do it in Blender with 3D or some kind of fun idea. I feel like we need to kind of talk as a team and figure out what that next passion is. Our developer Nathan makes games on the side, so I want to be a resource or a support for him so that he can like make games or push those out and help have Rogue help him. So in that way, it could be something like that. That's kind of the only things on the radar right now.
Well, that's all very exciting stuff. And I think like as Rogue grows and your ambitions like start to like come to life a little bit too, like more stuff will come out of that as well, right? How long have you guys been around?
So it was October, November of 2019, but it's kind of stayed a really lean team where
Yeah.
it's myself and Nathan and then contractors, but we tend to work with the same contractors or quite a few of the same contractors over and over, and we just haven't brought them in to the full ecosystem of a kind of employment, just to give them the autonomy and flexibility to continue to take on projects that they want, to collab with other agencies, to keep things really light and lean on our side budget wise, so that we can kind of continue to do other little things or pivot when necessary. So that's the kind of the core team. And yeah, I guess it's like 4 years. So 2019. Yeah.
So let's get into the work a little bit here. So obviously it's exciting to launch a new site and to be able to talk about work that was like maybe previously unreleased or just like didn't quite have a home, because it seemed like what was there before was like kind of a step between like, like starting and what it is now.
Yeah.
What project are you most like excited to talk about, to show? Like what's that showcase portfolio piece?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good question. I think that the branding work that we just put out for Lens, and that was a project that we released just a few months ago. So it's a digital publication for the creator economy. And we had the pleasure and the opportunity to work with an incredible CEO and founder, Joe Albanese, who is the founder of Stir. And this was an off brand of Stir. And it was just really interesting working with him and the team and to try to create a brand that was aspirational and was empowering creatives to do what they loved. So we created this motto of collab, publish, repeat. And that became essentially like the driving force for all of the creative. But it was something that we could all rally behind. And also we got an opportunity to work with a really great content strategist in order to work with the writers and kind of rally everyone together and try to get the ideas to vibe between writers, designers, and other kind of creatives. So YouTubers in that case. So that one we're really proud of. The website, the CEO developed himself. So we kind of had the opportunity to pass things off, which was an interesting experience. And I mean, it still came out really cool. We want to do a V2. So that should be fun down the road.
You want to know something crazy about this, Britton? We lost this project to you.
No way. That's
I
fucking crazy.
swear to
What?
God, we were talking to Joe for like maybe 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
And he just like dropped off. Like, he never told us anything. He was just like, we're working on Stir. Like we have this other thing, Canvas. Like, we were like having conversations about that. And he wasn't in a position to like hire us at the time. And he was like, we're working on it. We're getting there. And then we heard from him probably around the time that you guys started. And he was like, I'm ready to go. And then he just like never said anything again. But I'm not mad about it. Like, you guys did a great job. This is awesome. Like, dude, this is great. I'm glad that he hired somebody that could handle it. Like, that's what I care about. So great job. I'm glad that you're really proud of it because it's stunning. Good for you.
I have a story for you. So we chatted with the Lunchbox team, and we actually passed on the project prior because they had mentioned the timeline, and it freaked me out. I was like, "There's no way I could give you something in a timeline that was fitting." And I hope that you guys didn't do it in like 2 months or whatever they wanted.
No.
But yeah, but I didn't even like bother to, do even the hard kind of questioning and be like, hey, is that actually your timeline? What do you need? But honestly, I'm so glad that you guys got it because I would never have come up with that tattoo concept or anything like that. So I'm stoked about it. So I'm glad that we could actually share those kind of like, I'll call them war stories, if you will.
Yeah. No, that's so funny. Honestly, like there have been several times where we've gone up against friends of the studio, and we'll just be really honest. Like because we always ask like, who else are you talking to? People lie all the time about like, oh, we're not talking to anybody. Full of shit.
Yeah.
I don't care. I want to know if we're going up against somebody that we know, because I'll just reach out to you and I'll be like, yo, we're pitching against you. And I want to put them in the hot seat, not you. So here's how much we're going to charge. You should charge the exact same amount. Or we'll match you or whatever it is. Like we've done that before because there's certain people that like, I'm just not comfortable going up against, and I don't like being pitted against friends.
Yeah.
So I'll just conspire with that person to be like, yeah, like, let's just see how, like, we should get paid well to do this work. We work our asses off to make it incredible. Like, I don't want to like outbid somebody. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't want to be the cheapest option in the room, and I don't want you to be that either. Like, if we were more open about those things, like we raise our rates, actually, everybody does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if that looks like the option, then it's based on merit, right? And then they have a real decision to make around who's the best actual fit for the project. It's not just about cost. And their clients, they should pay us. So that's so funny, that the lunchbox thing, and then the canvas thing. I can't wait to tell our partners about that.
It's a small world.
I think that's all I have. We're
Mm.
also like almost 2.5 hours into this thing too. So
But honestly, thank you so much for even being here. I think that there's a ton of value in this. But to everyone listening, remember that we are all legendary and have an amazing story of our own. So on the journey, take the time to be kind, to grind and unwind, and let's make the world a better and more creative place.